Okay, so, we always talk about attraction, right? And like what makes someone attractive, and we hear about, like the golden ratio and all that
Yeah,
stuff.
symmetry, facial
Yeah,
symmetry.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, and like certain ratios and
Waist to hip
yeah,
ratio.
exactly. Yeah. But what if
Mm.
what if we like zoomed out for a second, we thought about something much more fundamental, like something you can't change, like with a diet or a makeover or something like that.
Right.
So, in this deep dive, we're looking at a study that suggests that a woman's hip width, like her actual hip width, might be linked to her likelihood of having one night stands.
Yes.
So, forget the waist to hip ratio for a second.
Yeah.
We're talking about the bones, baby.
The bones beneath.
Yes. This is really fascinating research that comes out of the University of Leeds,
Okay.
and it was published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior.
Okay.
Um, And what I thought was so interesting about this research was that they decided to move away from that waist to hip ratio
Right.
and look at absolute hip width in women.
And how that might play a role in some of their sexual history, specifically those casual encounters.
Okay, so why hip width specifically? Like what were they thinking? What was the evolutionary angle that they were going for?
Well, they were looking at,
Yeah.
the human body design and how we're bipedal.
Right.
So efficient walking requires a certain structure.
Right.
But then you have childbirth, and biomechanically wider hips are better for childbirth.
Right.
So they hypothesized that women with wider hips, perhaps, kind of subconsciously signaling a potentially easier birthing process, may have a different calculus when it comes to casual sex.
Right.
Risks and benefits associated from an evolutionary perspective.
So it's like our biology is still like whispering in our ears about, choices that we make in modern times?
It could be.
That's so wild.
It's about the body's subtle messaging potentially influencing behavior.
That's really wild.
Wow.
So how did they even begin to test something like that?
Right. So they got a group of 148
Okay.
sexually active women between 18 and 26 years old
Okay.
from the University of Leeds and the surrounding area.
Okay.
Each had at least one previous sexual partner.
That's it.
And a trained researcher took very specific measurements and focused on the distance between the iliac crests,
Okay.
which are the widest points of your pelvic bones, to get an accurate measure of hip width.
So they were really getting in there.
They were getting in there.
Yeah, like precise measurements.
Precise measurements.
Yeah.
And they also measured hip and waist circumference.
Right.
The usual metrics to see if hip width held more explanatory power than those measurements.
And they didn't just stop at the physical, right? They went into their personal histories.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the participants completed detailed questionnaires about their sexual experiences.
Wow.
This included age, at first intercourse, the total number of sexual partners, information about significant romantic relationships, and crucially for this study, the number of one-night stands they'd experienced
Okay.
to account for different ages of the women.
Uh-huh.
They even calculated the average number of sexual partners per year of sexual activity.
Wow. Okay, so they've got the skeletal data, and then they've got these pretty intimate details. So what did they find when
Yeah.
they crunched the numbers?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
They discovered a direct correlation between a woman's hip width and the total number of sexual partners she reported.
Okay.
But, and this is key, that link was primarily driven by the number of one-night stands.
Oh.
Women with wider hips, generally more than 36 centimeters, or about 14.2 inches,
Okay.
reported significantly more one-night stands compared to women with narrower hips, typically less than 31 centimeters or around 12.2 inches.
Okay, so we're talking about a couple inches difference here.
Yes.
And it's looking like the wider hips were correlating with more one-night stands.
Yes, that's the pattern that emerged
Okay.
from their analysis. In fact, they found that women who reported that a large proportion of their sexual encounters, about 3 out of 4,
Okay.
were one-night stands, had hips that were on average at least 2 centimeters wider than women who didn't.
Wow. So, okay, but what about waist to hip ratio? I mean, we always hear about this. It's like, that's supposed to be like the key indicator of attractiveness and fertility and all that.
Exactly.
Where does that fit into this?
And this is a really interesting divergence from previous thinking.
Okay.
This particular study found no statistically significant connection between waist-to-hip ratio
Okay.
and any of the measures of sexual behavior they examined.
Wow.
This suggests that at least within this cohort,
Yeah.
the absolute width of the hips,
Okay.
rather than that ratio between waist and hips, appeared to be the more relevant physical characteristic when it came to those casual sexual encounters.
Interesting. Okay, so are they saying then that it all comes back to like this evolutionary thing?
Right.
Like the narrow hips for walking and wider hips for childbirth?
That's their primary interpretation.
Okay.
So wider hips might subconsciously signal to a woman's own biology a potentially lower risk of complications during childbirth.
Right.
And this, in turn, could perhaps lower the perceived evolutionary cost associated with casual sexual encounters, leading to a greater openness to them.
Yeah, it's like built into us, almost.
Potentially, yeah. A very long-term, deeply ingrained potential influence.
Wow. I mean, this is really fascinating, but I can also imagine some people listening to this and they're like, what,
Sure.
what are you trying to say here? Like, are you saying that our skeletons are influencing our choices when it comes to these complex behaviors?
Yes, and it's important to acknowledge the
Of
limitations
course.
of
Yeah.
the study. So first of all, the sample size.
Yeah.
While a good starting point is relatively modest,
Right.
at 148 women,
Right.
and they were drawn from a specific demographic,
Yeah.
young university-aged women in a particular geographic location.
Yeah.
So we can't automatically assume that these findings apply to all women across all ages and cultures.
Right. And we're also relying on self-reported data here, which
Yes.
is, not always the most accurate or reliable. Right. Because people might not remember things correctly or accurately, or maybe, they're kind of pressured to answer a certain way because of, social pressures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Memory recall can be fallible,
Yeah.
and there's always the potential for social desirability bias
Yeah.
to affect how people answer sensitive questions.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, and this is crucial
Yeah.
to understand,
Yeah.
this study identifies a correlation,
Right.
a tendency for these two things, hip width and one-night stands,
Yeah.
to occur together. It does not establish a direct cause and effect relationship.
Okay. So big distinction there.
Huge distinction.
Yeah.
There could be other as yet unmeasured factors at play
Right.
that influence both physical characteristics and behavior.
So this gives us a really interesting potential link.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not the final word on this.
Right.
So what did the study authors say about where we could go from here?
Well, they emphasize the need for larger scale studies
Right.
with more diverse participant groups,
Right.
spanning a wider range of ages,
Yeah.
cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses, to see if these initial findings are robust and generalizable.
Right.
They also proposed investigating the interplay
Okay.
between physical attributes like hip width
Yeah.
and non-physical factors like personality traits, social environment, and individual attitudes towards relationships and sexuality to get a more holistic understanding
Yeah.
of what shapes these behaviors.
Okay, so to kind of sum all this up, this University of Leeds research offers a really surprising new perspective on what might influence a woman's sexual behavior.
Yes.
We see this potential link between hip width and casual encounters,
Yeah.
but we didn't see the connection with waist to hip ratio in this particular study.
That's right.
But, it's a correlation observed within a specific group,
Right.
and further investigation is definitely needed to explore the broader implications of this.
Absolutely. It prompts an interesting question for you to consider.
Okay.
How might these deeply ingrained evolutionary pressures,
Yeah.
these subtle biological undercurrents,
Yeah. Continue to shape our modern relationship dynamics and individual choices in ways that we're only beginning to fully appreciate. It really makes you think. Click like and subscribe to the Unlock Your Mind channel.